It's 8 weeks since House Flipper 2 was released, but is it really better than the original game? Let's do a side-by-side comparison. Before we begin, I just want to let you know that I'll be showing the original House Flipper game with all 7 DLCs installed, because in my opinion the base game alone is pretty bare bones. House Flipper 2, however, has no DLCs available yet, so we'll just be looking at the base game. Let's start with the basics, the tools and game mechanics. A lot of the original House Flipper tools have been carried over to the sequel, and some of them have gone through some changes. But are those changes improvements? So first up in both games we have the Move Objects tool, which is basically just your hands, which you can use to move objects. In the original House Flipper, this tool was used to collect trash as well. However, in House Flipper 2 we actually have an extra tool for this, and we now get to fill trash bags and throw them into wheelie bins. This is really fun when it's a novelty, but for me that novelty wore off pretty quick. But the good news is the game doesn't actually care if you bother to put the trash bags in the bins, so I just took to doing this. The cleaning tool is pretty self-explanatory. It is the tool we use to clean. It's not really changed a whole lot in House Flipper 2, which I think is a classic case of if it's not broke, don't fix it. And thankfully we still have the window cleaning mechanic, which I think we can agree is one of the most satisfying tools in House Flipper. Something that has changed quite a lot in the second game is the painting tool, and at first it's actually a lot slower, but if you persevere, then before long you'll have fully levelled up the skill and it will be faster and much more satisfying. This is because on top of painting pixel by pixel, we now also have the added step of setting the area in which we are going to paint. I will say this is very tedious, but once you've levelled up the skill you won't actually have to do that step anymore. And there is a major advantage to the new painting mechanic because it gives us a lot more creative freedom. You could paint your walls half one colour and half another, you could do half paint and half tiles or wallpaper, and if you're feeling really creative, you could even do pixel art. Now when it comes to the Sell Objects tool, it might seem at first like it hasn't changed at all. What we get in House Flipper 2 is the Flipper tool, and it's still used to sell objects. However, as you level up the skill, you'll unlock more functions. You can actually use the Flipper tool to change the style of objects, aka the colour and material, and you can also copy the style of one object and paste it onto another, which is a godsend when you're trying to give a house a consistent style and colour scheme. And finally, you can use the Flipper tool to duplicate objects, including their colour and material, which can be really useful for things like doors and windows. The wall building tool is another one that's been given an overhaul. Whereas in the original game walls were built panel by panel, in the sequel they are built square by square, which again gives us more creative freedom since we can vary wall heights. It also renders the Build Lintels tool from House Flipper obsolete, so that tool doesn't feature in the second game. I think we can all agree that demolishing walls is one of the most satisfying things you can do in any game, and House Flipper definitely ticks that box. Much like the Build tool, in House Flipper 2, we can now demolish walls square by square, which gives us a lot more control. You do have to hold the button down briefly to demolish, which does take a little bit of the fun away because you can't just attack the wall like a maniac. But I do think it's worth the compromise for the precision the new mechanic gives us. Tiling and panelling in House Flipper was extremely tedious in my opinion, and I much prefer the wallpaper tool in House Flipper 2, which is faster and more convenient. In fact, I'd really like it if we had the option to apply paint in the same way, just because sometimes you don't want to be there for several minutes painting one wall. The vacuum tool seems to be used a lot more in House Flipper 2 than in the original game, and it's even got a slot on the tool wheel now. I also haven't encountered any cockroaches in House Flipper 2, but I guess whether that's a good thing or a bad thing depends on your personal preference. The tool works the same way in both games, and that's fine because I don't think it was something that needed to be changed. Now, there are some tools that appeared in House Flipper 1 that aren't in the sequel. although most of them were added with DLC. The one base game house flipper tool that hasn't carried over into the second game is plastering, and that wasn't even in the tool wheel, and I personally don't miss it. Most of the DLC tool additions came with the garden and farm flipper DLCs. These included the shovel, hose, lawnmower, brush cutter and axe from Garden Flipper, and the claw hammer, grappling hook, hoe, chainsaw, drone and house building tool from Farm Flipper. None of these are included in House Flipper 2 at the time I'm making this video. Notably, gardening is base game, but rather than cutting down trees, you can only sell the trees and plants and buy new ones. On the one hand, I miss some of these tools quite a lot, particularly the lawnmower. Mowing lawns is just the kind of repetitive activity that's relaxing as heck in a game, but I would never willingly do in real life. However, I also feel some of them were unnecessary, like the brush cutter, which I personally felt was kind of obsolete as you could do the same job with the lawnmower. The drone and grappling hook were quite useful, although you can still buy scaffolding to get to the upper stories. One thing I really do miss is the moving scaffold truck, because having to keep climbing down and moving the scaffolding is very annoying. Also, I miss doing this.
Bed goes up, bed goes down, bed goes up, bed goes down.
The one DLC tool that wasn't from Garden or Farm Flipper was the flamethrower, and that came with the free Apocalypse DLC. Now, I'll be the first to admit that wielding a flamethrower is a bit of a dream come true. But in terms of gameplay, it wasn't really that necessary unless I missed something, so I don't think it's a great tragedy to lose it. And who knows, maybe it could be added to House Flipper 2 in a future update or DLC. There are two tools that have been added to House Flipper 2 that weren't in the original game. One, which I mentioned earlier, is the trash tool, and the other is the wiring tool. This is used to connect lights to light switches, and although you can turn on a light by clicking the light itself, it won't work with a switch unless you wire it. Unfortunately, I think the ability to turn the light on without using a switch renders the wiring tool kind of obsolete, though I imagine it was meant to make it an optional function. Although it's a good idea and a nice addition, I personally feel it's a bit too simplistic and hope that it's updated to become more complex in the future. On the whole, I think the selection of tools available has been streamlined, so there are fewer tools available in House Flipper 2, but the functionality of most of them has been massively improved. For me personally, I actually prefer having fewer tools, because often simple is better. Once you've got all the farm and garden tools added to the original House Flipper, it's easy to kind of lose track and become a bit overwhelmed. So my verdict is that in terms of tools, I do prefer House Flipper 2. Just a quick break to ask, if you're enjoying this video, please like and subscribe for a variety of cozy gaming content, including tips videos, reviews, speed builds and more. There is another feature I haven't talked about yet, and that is assembly. In the original game, we had to assemble and plumb in sinks, toilets, baths and showers. This has not been included in House Flipper 2, however, there is a new minigame which allows us to assemble various items such as lamps. In return for assembling them within a time limit, you get a discount on those items in the in-game store. But it is a small discount, and personally I don't feel like it's worth the effort, so I haven't spent much time on this minigame. Next, I want to look at the customization options for furniture, wallpaper, floors, etc. In the original House Flipper, we were able to customise the colour and material of most items. Things like wallpaper and tiles had a small selection of colour options for each pattern. In House Flipper 2 there are 4 colour palettes, offering a huge range of shades, and all of these colours can be applied to pretty much anything customisable. Then there are a range of patterns available to use as wallpaper, but these same patterns can be applied to furniture items, particularly furniture that has fabric. And you can also customise each pattern further by changing the colours and the size and rotation of the patterns. If all that's not enough, There's also a huge range of materials that can be applied to most items. I particularly like the metal finish, like this rose gold for example. I just think they look really good. Honestly, having this level of customization makes the game so enjoyable. I could play this for hours on end and not get bored because the possibilities are endless. So again, for customization, I think House Flipper 2 definitely improves upon the original game. One of the big selling points of House Flipper 2 is that it has a sandbox mode. If you have the Farm Flipper DLC installed, then you can build from scratch in the original game, but it's not a true sandbox, as you have to use money earned from career jobs to pay for your materials, and it can get pretty pricey. Even so, let's take a quick look at building from scratch in both games. In the first game, building from scratch was added almost 5 years after launch, because players wanted it. And while it is great to see the features people really want added to the game, building from scratch is unfortunately quite fiddly. The thing we have to bear in mind is that the game wasn't originally designed to support this feature, whereas House Flipper 2 was, and it shows. The way the game mechanics have been streamlined and simplified, and honestly just the process of building a house in House Flipper 2 feels a lot more intuitive and easier. That's not to say it's perfect, but it's clearly been well planned and executed. The way that walls and roofs are placed in the original House Flipper made it kind of difficult to be really creative. Don't get me wrong, I've seen some amazing builds that people have made in that game, so clearly it is possible. I personally just find building in House Flipper 2 a lot more simple, which leaves room for me to figure out how to do cool stuff like build a house on stilts. So we've looked at building from scratch, but how do the selections of career jobs from each game compare? As I said earlier, I play House Flipper 2 with all 7 DLCs installed, which gives a total of 93 jobs available. However, the base game itself has only 26 jobs. In House Flipper 2, which as we know currently doesn't have any DLC, there are currently 24 jobs. Slightly less but pretty close. So clearly as it stands you'll get a lot more playtime, at least career-wise, from playing the first game with all the DLCs. However, it's important to bear in mind that there could potentially be a lot more added to House Flipper 2 in the future. The original House Flipper was released nearly 6 years ago, has had a ton of content added, and the devs have even said they're still planning to add more content even though the sequel has been released. That gives me a lot of hope that the devs will be equally dedicated to House Flipper 2 and that we could get a lot more content over the next few years. And it's not just about quantity, how do the jobs compare quality-wise? In general, so far, I found the jobs in House Flipper 2 to be more immersive, more varied and more in-depth than the ones in the first game. That's not to say the jobs in the original aren't great. Clearly, if I'd never got so hooked on House Flipper 1, I probably wouldn't now be hooked on House Flipper 2, let alone making this video. But it seems to me that the devs have learned a thing or two from making the original game and applied what they've learned to the sequel. The jobs in House Flipper 2 take all the good stuff from the original game and make it better, more original, more varied, more customizable. To be honest, I think what makes most of them so good is that all the stuff I've talked about throughout this video, the customization, the accessibility and the simplicity all make the game a dream to play. So I've gushed a lot over House Flipper 2 in this video, and that's out of pure love for the franchise. Is it the perfect game? No. At the time of recording, there are no curtains or blinds in the game, and that honestly has been driving me nuts. But the original game also started out with no curtains or blinds, and look how far that's come since launch. I wasn't sent any keys for either House Flipper or House Flipper 2, and I wasn't asked to make this video, but I adore both games and I really want to share that with you. Would I go back to House Flipper 1 now I've played House Flipper 2? Well, I did for this video and I loved it. And to be fair, there are quite a few jobs I haven't yet completed in the game, so it's likely that I will revisit it sometimes. But I think it's fair to say that my heart is now with House Flipper 2. I'm so excited to continue playing and to see what might be added to it in the future. Obviously all this is just my opinion, so feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon with more cozy games.